speaker today. We have an in-house speaker. He is a nutritionist and a food scientist, also with a professional background in Federal Nutrition Assistance Program. He is a graduate of Virginia Tech and initially performed research on irradiated meats and taught general microbiology at Iowa State University. During 2001-2004, he has served as a deputy administrator for special nutrition programs at USDA Food and Nutrition Service, leading and managing nutrition programs such as Women, Infant, and Children program, School Lunch program, and 10 other USDA nutrition programs. He has also provided leadership resulting in the enactment of the Child Nutrition and WIC Reauthorization Act of 2004. Currently, he holds appointments as an associate professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Science of Texas A&M University, and is the founder and director of the Institute for Obesity Research and Program Evaluation with Texas A&M University System. His research at Texas A&M University include examining the ileal brake mechanisms such as the glucagon-like peptide 1 in response to food emulsions. He has also focused on projects related to public health and nutrition program evaluations, including evaluation of impacts of WIC food benefits in the revised food packages, and evaluation of intervention for school breakfast and school lunch programs, and evaluation of the nutrition implication of limiting starchy vegetables in school meals. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present to you Dr. Peter Murano.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I was wondering if there's anything that I could do with the light.
Is it too,
It's probably a little too bright. I'm not sure if you have to turn them all off. Yeah.
let's try this.
Oh, perfect. Everybody's on this side, pretty much. That's the way you like it, eh? That's all right. Okay. So let me start by telling you I had no idea that I would leave the laboratory for a different kind of research laboratory. And I'm talking about the laboratory that's out there. This is called the field laboratory, field research laboratory. Some of you probably are aware of that and maybe have some experiences with it, but it was new to me. I was trained as a bench scientist, so to speak, in nutrition. I did evaluations using Chinese hamster ovary cells on an unscheduled DNA synthesis, sister chromatid exchange.
Gas leak at Student Rec Center. Building evacuated. Avoid area till further notice. 11:32 a.m.
I've never had that experience before. Speaking about different experiences. And the bottom line is working with programs and with people in those programs. It's a different kind of research and it has its own challenges. So I'm going to hopefully educate some of you as to those challenges when I discuss and describe one type of project in particular. So I hope you'll enjoy the ride. This is the outline of the presentation. Essentially, I'm going to give you a lot of background because I'm assuming not too many students have backgrounds in programmatic research. I'll discuss some of the actual research and the research questions and so forth that we have addressed in my research program, go over the methodology that we use, and of course discuss our findings and maybe talk about a few opportunities for research with you. It's always good to acknowledge the people who you work with and who are responsible for you getting anywhere in life, and I will do that first rather than wait till the end, just in case there's a fire drill or something. So Dr. Capps and Dr. Ishdorsh are ag economists, and I've enjoyed working with the two of them, Lindsay Field and Ashley Hutto, Lisa and Paula over in the department, and several of students, including 2 grad students and what we called our plate waste warriors. So before I go any further, how many people have an idea what I'm talking about when I say plate waste? Okay, about half and half. That's good. So now you're going to know. I appreciate the introduction from Wu. Now, my reason for being here is having worked in Washington with USDA. Completely changed my life in terms of what I wanted to do professionally. I worked with the USDA Food and Nutrition Service during the time span of 2001 to 2004 as a job. I had to leave here. This was not an IPA where you work for 6 months and you come back to the university. This was almost 4 years. I had to leave here and get a guaranteed letter, actually from the president, to have a job when I come back. So it was not a little thing. And I'll tell you, that was the most difficult position, but also the most rewarding position I've ever had, working at USDA. Great people there. So I'm going to talk to you about the National School Lunch Program, which is one of the roughly dozen nutrition assistance programs that the Food and Nutrition Service operates at the federal level, and we feel it at the state and local levels as consumers. And you see the number there, 31 plus million school lunches served every day. So imagine what that is over a year's time. So my postulate to you is that this makes for a very good research laboratory because so many people, children, are being impacted by that school lunch. And school lunch, Dr. Chapkin, is not the same as it was in your day or even further back in my day. USDA has gone to great pains over the years to revise nutrition standards and bring the nutrition level to what it is today. School meals are designed, as it says here, to provide key nutrients for children, and the menus are quite varied, but still there's not much research done regarding how much of that food are the kids eating and how much are they wasting. Of course, school meals can only provide adequate nutrition when the food is consumed. And through an examination of plate waste, then, it becomes possible to get an inside look into the behaviors, eating behaviors of these school children. I'll talk to you a moment about food insecurity because superimposed on feeding children is this reality that we have in the United States of America regarding hunger, because that's what food insecurity is all about. In fact, the USDA has recently updated its information regarding the definitions for food security versus food insecurity. And over here are the latest definitions. In case you don't know the difference, food insecurity is hunger, and there are different categories, very low, low food insecurity, depending on the specific situation in the household. This is a slide that shows us how food insecure the United States of America is. Okay? What do you notice? In the time frame from 2007 to 2008, there's been a spike, an increase in food insecure households. Nobody likes this. Why is this happening? That's not the focus of our discussion. But when you get involved in this research, these are issues that become important in terms of evaluations of data. Superimposed on top of this food insecurity issue is the childhood obesity issue. And I'm sure everyone sitting here knows what the health implications of obesity can be. I attempted to capture the majority of them on this slide. You can see your favorite one perhaps up there. Talking about favorites, I like the state of Texas. Everything's bigger in Texas, but it's not good when the number for childhood obesity rates is big, as it is in Texas. But as you can see, if you can read that small print, childhood obesity is fairly prevalent and widespread across the nation. So we could easily say that obesity as an area of research is very important on a multitude of levels. In fact, there are an amazing and complex cellular signaling pathways related to hunger and satiety, but also fat tissue deposition, adiposity, and how that's related to inflammation, insulin resistance, metabolic disease. I'm sure most of you have heard of adiponectin, and there's a picture of that molecule showing the domains in its structure on the left, and on the right, I'm sure you've heard about leptin. Similar, we have a picture over there. These two peptides function differently depending on the weight status of the person. And as it says in the center there, it can be dysregulated, which has a host of complications and implications. Other hormones you've probably heard of are ghrelin and leptin. Okay, whereas the other hormones are related to inflammation, either being pro or anti. Ghrelin and leptin are implicated as hunger and satiety hormones. So all of these hormones are active in the school children, depending on the individual situation with these kids. So as a quick review, this is not the focus of my research. Do you know there are two types of fat tissue? Lean fat and obese fat. Okay, and associated with each one of these are ATMs, and we're not talking about Texas A&M this time. Okay. Adipose tissue macrophages. So there's an intertwining of metabolic pathways with immune system pathways. In that adiponectin, which is part of the ATM macrophage 2 class, has an impact on which way the macrophage is going to go. So we say down here that adiponectin promotes polarization of the macrophages toward the anti-inflammatory phenotype, which is the lean fat side. But in obese individuals who have obese fat adipose tissue, these markers are preferentially secreted. So you see how complex this is, but also how the details are nicely worked out. And then, have you ever heard of the hunger-obesity paradox? Another thing to keep in mind. Yeah, this one is actually the term was coined roughly around 2006, 2007. It relates to the paradoxical link between food absence, in other words, hunger, food insecurity, and obesity. And you might scratch your head at first thinking, how can those two situations coexist? Okay, but one researcher has said that hunger and obesity are often the flip sides to the same malnutrition coin. So you may not be able to see this all the way, but it's a very nicely worked out cycle, starting with hunger up at the top, food insecurity, which then drives this entire cycle of weight gain and metabolic disease. If you think back to the previous slide of lean fat and obese fat, and the phenotype for the anti-inflammatory adipokines, it's a fact that when you look at this cycling here, that those folks, in fact, I should go back to it, on this side are lower for disease risk, right, than the ones over on the other side. And so part of this hunger-obesity paradox explanation should impress us that because of lack of food, that can push people into that higher risk for disease. Not just hunger, higher risk for disease. Alrighty, if you know about the USDA, they like to conduct research. They have a branch called CNPP, the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion. And one of CNPP's claims to fame is their Healthy Eating Index, the HEI. And essentially what that tool is, it's a way to look at the typical American consumer's diet, looking for essentially variety and adequacy in terms of nutrition. So you see the categories here, perhaps, and the bottom line is that in terms of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, the typical American diet is severely lacking in those components. Something else we have to know when we contemplate doing a research project using school children. The USDA has just recently updated, for the first time in 15 years, the school nutrition standards for their meals, school breakfast, school lunch, especially. And this is done to better coordinate those meals with the DGA, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And what the Food and Nutrition Service would like to be able to do is feed hungry children, feed any child who's in the school nutrition environment, the cafeteria, while addressing childhood obesity, and doing this through prudent menu planning. Okay, some of you perhaps are pursuing or will pursue also, in addition to your graduate degree, an RD degree. Okay. Dietitians work at schools, as I'm sure you know, and oversee menu planning, and that's good. The new nutrition standards, look at the dates. They're just happening now, okay, depending on which program, lunch or breakfast. You've heard of shortfall nutrients. These are the 4 shortfall nutrients: fiber, potassium, calcium, and vitamin D, identified in the latest issuance of the dietary guidelines. When's the next set due to come out of DGA? This is all focused on the USA, I realize that, in nutrition policy. 2015, so next year. But the 2010 dietary guidelines identified 2 nutrients found in a variety of vegetables that are of concern. They don't usually think of calcium or vitamin D, particularly coming from vegetables, but fiber and potassium, yes.
Code Maroon. Gas leak at Student Rec Center.
This is
Building
exciting.
evacuated. Avoid area till further notice. 11:47 a.m.
All right. At least it gives me an idea of the time, so I know if I have to speed up or slow down. So I put this table together for a quick comparison between the previous nutrition standards for school meals and the current. And you see how they've gone from not much to more. And the important components listed on the left: the fruits and vegetables, whole grain, and milk. Milk going to lower fat varieties, whether flavored or unflavored. Subgroups of vegetables now are important in these school meals. And these are the subgroups, never before segregated out in this fashion. And the recommendations now for consumption according to subgroup. So the dark green, the red orange, the legumes, the starchy, and then other, which captures a variety of vegetables. And you see the amounts from the previous chart, but also here. Why? Why bother? As I'm sure you know, consumption of these particular subgroups can impact chronic disease risk. And then there's this issue, which you may not know about, the white potato. The white potato is actually now a hot potato, politically, or a political football, if you know what that means. I'll tell you what it means. White potatoes are controversial in school meals. On the one hand, there's data to show that white potatoes, depending on how they're prepared, you know, is it a whole baked potato? Is it French fry? Is it tater tot? What is it? Can be a good source of fiber and potassium. Okay, on the other hand, it might be a fairly high source of calories and fat. But these 2 key programs the National School Lunch Program and the WIC program. By the way, did you know 55% of the babies born in the United States of America are born to WIC mothers? 55%, 1 out of 2. It's an amazing statistic. So that program has tremendous outreach potential. So when there's a policy decision made in WIC or a policy decision made in school lunch, millions of American citizens are affected. And so right now, the white potato, getting ahead of myself, is being considered to be pushed out of federal nutrition assistance programs. Is that a good thing? Would you agree with that? Would you sign a petition? Yay or nay? And perhaps part of the root cause of this is due to scientific inquiry, which is what we want, right? We want evidence, science basis for policy regarding health and nutrition. We don't want some politician deciding, okay, the school lunch program should have this and this and this because I like those things. They give me, those interest groups give me a lot of money so that I can keep my job in Washington. Okay? So the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies sets aside a special committee to review the school lunch and the WIC programs and make recommendations based on their review of the literature, the scientific evidence-based literature. So that sets the stage for decision-making in politics, okay? So this is the deal right here. White potatoes potentially to be excluded completely from the WIC program. The WIC program serves infants and children up to age 5 and the mothers. Okay? No white potatoes. So we would want to ask a question. Would eliminating white potatoes from WIC be counter to the recommendations of the 2010 dietary guidelines? And I'll leave that in your lap. You'd have to do some checking to see the nutrient composition of white potatoes that would be in the WIC program and how they would contribute to the nutrition benefit that WIC is trying to deliver. Keeping in mind that WIC is a supplemental nutrition assistance program, that this is not supposed to be all the food a participant will get who's on WIC. What about the other program that I'm focusing on, the school lunch program and white potatoes? Okay, this was big news just a couple of years ago. The USDA secretary and the first lady came out with the new nutrition school meal standards, part of the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. And this is what we've already discussed. Okay? But look at this quote here. USDA built the new guidelines around recommendations from a panel of experts convened by the Institute of Medicine, a gold standard for evidence-based health analysis. Beginning July 2012, the meals will blah, blah. We've seen this already. Okay? So the USDA, and I would argue rightfully so, turns to the Institute of Medicine for guidance before issuing a new rule regulation that's going to impact programs and therefore American citizens. Here's the controversy. Some people have raised concerns that reduction, elimination of starchy vegetables, white potatoes from school meals would result in a couple of unintended consequences. Okay? White potatoes are very cheap, inexpensive. What do you replace them with if you take them out of school meals? Okay. In addition, the data that the Institute of Medicine reviewed, according to the information that I was able to review, comes from an earlier CINDA school nutrition dietary assessment study. Okay. And this is meant to convey the amount of potatoes, starchy vegetables, and other starchy vegetables that are currently being offered, served, not consumed necessarily, in schools. The only school level where more than the Institute of Medicine recommended amounts of these particular vegetables are being consumed is at high school. Okay? But middle schools and elementary schools are below. So the USDA says it's working to finalize this rule. It's their goal to prepare a final rule that meets the commitment to develop, here we go, with the science-based, which is key, nutrition standards that are practical for schools and reinforce the healthy eating habits that hopefully begin at home. So I would want to ask the question of anyone here, do you know the nutrient composition of potatoes? Are they nutritious or are they not particularly nutritious? And I'm not talking about sweet potatoes, I'm talking about white potatoes. This table gives us maybe a little bit of surprising information because it's not just a baked potato here. We've got boiled and French fries, and I've highlighted the French fry information. Does anything strike you as interesting? We're looking at energy, potassium content, dietary fiber especially. Now you expect the calories to go up in French fries compared to a baked potato, which it does. Did you expect to see more potassium and fiber? I did not either. Okay, so that gets you scratching your head perhaps. The N. Haynes study from 2009 to 2010 shows us the potassium and fiber mean intakes for people, male and female, by age. Okay. Typically under-consuming fiber and under-consuming potassium versus the content in white potatoes. So in other words, white potatoes can be a good source of fiber and potassium for the population. That's the argument against eliminating them from these programs. And this slide just shows in red the potassium content and the fiber content of these potato products. And you see over here, they're all stacked up at the high end. That's for potassium, and fiber content distributed throughout, but got some high ones over there too. I won't go through all these details here, but suffice it to say that the more recent N. Haynes data set is portraying the white potatoes in a fairly positive light. And then perhaps a move to reduce or eliminate them from federal nutrition assistance programs might not be prudent. Now that we have a better idea regarding the issue regarding white potatoes in school lunch, what about some research that we've got going on? So we've conducted plate waste studies in 2 independent school districts in Texas, Bryan and Dallas. By the way, it's very difficult to conduct research in a school. You'll get turned away 9 times out of 10. Because the schools are very protective of the children. And you could have the best intention and put forward a proposal that shows there's going to be a direct benefit to the school, if not also to the school children. You have to be very thankful when it happens that they let you in the door, and I am. We employed traditional methodologies to quantify plate waste. We assessed aggregate waste and consumption, obtaining data from schools both pre and post those revised nutrition standards. We looked at the plate waste of specific nutrients. We examined also, which I think is novel, I have not seen this in the literature, specific entree and vegetable pairings to see if there's any dynamic interaction there on plate waste. Can you imagine what I'm saying? When entree A is served with vegetable B or vegetable C or vegetable D, is the plate waste different? And then we go to entree B with those different vegetable pairings, is the plate waste different? So we're looking at that. What is plate waste? I think you probably know very well. The photos show it there. And sometimes plate waste is incredibly large in that the children barely touch the food. If I had a nickel for every milk carton that was unopened after the meal and returned to the counter, probably wouldn't have to work anymore. Anyway, plate waste, the quantity of edible portions that are served uneaten, common reason for food loss at food service levels. So there's a dynamic there that involves waste, wasted time of meal preparation, wasted cost of paying food service workers if the food is not going to be consumed. Not just the waste that the kids leave on the trays, although that's the focus of our research, but there are other considerations. So information regarding the schools in our study, Brian and Dallas, we focused on the elementary school level. The kids are this tall, by the way. It's cute to see them, if you haven't been in the school lately, carrying a gigantic tray when the tray is half as big as they are. And I think, as I see that, are they going to actually eat all that food? And some of them, bless their hearts, do. So the selection of the schools in the ISDs, the 3 elementary schools each, we looked at the percentage of free and reduced price participants, which is 2 categories in addition to fully paid for the children who participate in school lunch program. And also the student enrollment, the numbers. So these were this is the data regarding the participants in Bryan ISD, in which we went on 2 separate observation trips in spring and fall of 2012, and 1 for Dallas, going K through 5. And those are the N numbers up in red for the number of students. The percent free eligible lunches, when that number is high, you think, well, those are poor kids. And I would hypothesize those kids are hungrier and they're going to leave less waste. That's one of the hypotheses in our research. Didn't always turn out that way. Interesting. And you see how they're matched based on that criteria. Another factor to consider in doing this kind of research is offer versus serve, which is the mechanism used by some schools to serve the meals to the children. Schools in our study participated in offer versus serve, but what is it and what does it have to do with plate waste? Well, I won't go through all of this, but essentially the child in offer versus serve schools has the opportunity and the right to deny 1 or 2 items that are being offered. But they do have to accept certain key foods, okay? And basically what the idea behind this is to reduce waste, okay? So offer versus serve schools inherently should show less plate waste because of the way offer versus serve works. And to understand offer versus serve, we have to know the definition of a food component versus a food item. Okay, and again, this is a detail that is of interest if you're going to do this kind of work, but we're going to go through it just by showing it without lingering on it. But you might know or not know about the meal pattern requirement for school meals. It's right here: fruits, vegetables, grains, meats or meat alternates, and fluid milk. School meal, cafeteria ladies, etc. It's complicated. It's not such an easy business. There are requirements, guidelines, standard operating procedures, and so forth that have to be followed. Not just cleaning up after the kids and after serving. And I brought two examples of how to understand OBS, but I think in the issue or interest of time, I'm going to move past these. Again, the schools in Bryan and Dallas were OBS schools. So the methodology that we used for plate waste, these were the number of visits in the schools, okay, 10 visits, 20 visits there, 30 visits. The reason to select a certain N for the number of visits based on school size and so forth, we need representativeness of our data regarding those school demographic categories. For instance, we need statistical validity. We also need to understand the variables that could impact the results, such as the grade. Is it a kindergarten class or is it a 5th grade class? What time of year is it? Is it fall or spring? The menus change, in other words. The day of the week. Can the day of the week impact eating behavior? Yay, it's Friday. I think I'm going to feel good today. Maybe I'll eat something. Whereas, oh, it's Monday. And then what I'm particularly interested in, the entree and vegetable pairing. We looked at cost as well, and that's what the economists were involved with. I was more interested in nutrients lost, although dollars lost is extremely important. Our analysis strategy, we're looking at starchy vegetable types. We're looking at popularity of vegetables, popularity of entrees, and the plate waste by school and by grade. We came up with this design, which has worked fairly well for us. And we needed a fairly large contingency of undergraduate students to help us achieve this. So I won't go through all the steps, but one of the key steps comes at the beginning, where you measure the pre-weights of the uneaten food items as they're prepared for service. And typically we would get 10 pre-weights per food item because there's variability in whatever the entree or side happens to be. And then we segregate and aggregate based on, is this wasted entree? It goes in this bin. Is this wasted vegetable 1 or vegetable 2? And we keep everything separate. And yet we aggregated. There's no other way to do it from my experience, because the lunch service goes so fast and those kids, they move them in and out. We were very happy to be able to aggregate and segregate the way we did and take the material back and weigh in the lab. Okay. Since we had the pre-weights and the final weights of waste, we knew what the waste was, but also what the consumption was. And that's what this essentially tells us, how to arrive at those figures. So these are measurements. And again, how to determine plate waste. What do we find out? I couldn't bring all the results. We're still evaluating this data, in fact, but I selected some of the findings. So for instance, one of the things that we were interested in looking at as a research question was any differences between behaviors pre and post implementation of the new federal nutrition school meal standards. First of all, these are the occurrences by vegetable subgroup. Okay. And you see where the starchy, other than potato, as well as the potato, take up over half of the vegetable subgroups in what we observed. And there's the dark green, the red, orange, and other. Interesting to see that. I would love to report to you that we had many statistically significant results. We had one in terms of plate waste, pre and post the new nutrition standards. The legume category. Does spring come before or after fall? It comes first. Okay, so the fall, we see that the legume plate waste was significantly lowered in fall of 2012 compared to spring, which means after the nutrition standards. But none of the other changes were statistically significant. This one, we didn't have the data. Okay, so that's one statistically significant result. But we also looked for trends. The fiber is very much underconsumed. Okay? So here we see the waste column, the average amount per serving, the intake per student of fiber. And up at the top, toward the top, you see the Institute of Medicine recommendation for fiber, 8.5 grams per student at lunch, so per lunch. And we looked at the same thing for potassium. And we saw that there were some increases here, and a decrease there for potassium. Vitamin A, an increase there. Okay. An increase there for sodium. Sodium, by the way, sodium targets are due to be reduced drastically in the coming years, perhaps to an unrealistic level of consumption. It'll be interesting to watch how that all pans out. But they're phasing in lower and lower sodium standards in school meals. Okay, this is a repeat slide without any of those big arrows. Sorry about that. The next series of slides will examine relationships between what I told you I think is novel, looking at vegetable and entree pairings. So this we did in Bryan with the Bryan data for now. And you see the total numbers that we're looking at here in our sample size. And for instance, this is one example out of all the data, looking at the relationship between these entrees and broccoli waste. Down here, you can see by the bars that the greatest waste of the vegetable, the broccoli, came when it was served with a corn dog. And the least waste was when it was a ham and cheese hot pocket. What would I do with this information if it's indeed reliable, if I'm the food service manager? And I was concerned about vegetable consumption. I would probably want to menu the ones that have the least waste more often, if this is indeed something we can rely on. Another example, mashed potato waste, based on different entrees there. Okay. The Munchable had the least waste when it was paired with the mashed potato. French fries, I had to put that one in there. Least waste when it's with a hamburger, cheeseburger. I guess that makes sense. We also examined plate waste for all observable entree vegetable pairings, and there were many of them, to determine which were associated with the least waste and created sort of a top 10 list. And these are the ones right here, going 1 through 10. Okay. There's the hot dog with French fries, and you have the waste of the vegetable indicated. Anytime you see under 50% waste in these school meal programs, sad to say, that's pretty good. Okay, there's 5 through 8, and 9 and 10. So the previous observations don't prove anything. Okay, the data set is too small, needs to be reproduced, needs to be replicated in other school systems, in other states, etc. This is a first pilot type study to get a have a handle on the situation, what's happening. Okay? But I'm saying that they offer tenuous support to the notion or hypothesis that these pairings may have an impact on plate waste. As an exercise, an educational, intellectual, whatever exercise, you may be aware through any study you've done with toxicology that you can do a cost-benefit evaluation of any substance and regarding its toxicology or potential toxicity. And so I've adapted that thinking, looking at what we just were viewing, okay, and using USDA National School Lunch Program nutrition standards as our guide. For calories and sodium, there are standards, but there's no total fat standard. So I had to make something up based on what I thought was reasonable, 30% of calories coming from fat. That would be 18 to 22 grams of fat, roughly, in the meal. No standard yet for potassium. So potassium is sort of the counter to sodium intake. And so here's the sodium value flipped around. No standard for fiber. Using that, which is very close to the Institute of Medicine at 8.5 grams per liter. So by doing this, I have a profile now for what I'm suggesting could be a healthy pairing of entree and vegetable versus a less healthy or risky if we're using the toxicology terminology. And now when I show you the actual data here, what we did is we looked at fat and sodium from these particular meals and compared them to potassium and fiber. So the unhealthy versus the healthy nutrients, so to speak. And we plotted them in this quadrant, which I borrowed, like I say, from the science of toxicology, where as the risk goes up and the benefit goes up, you have 4 possible outcomes. Okay, in quadrant A, you have the ideal situation of low risk, little or no risk, but highest benefit, and so on and so forth. So when we superimpose this scheme on our meals, our pairings, this is what we came up with. Okay, truth be told, this wasn't really ideal. It was more on the border. But I pushed it up there for dramatic impact. And this was not dangerous, but I pushed, it was more in this area. I pushed it down, or actually this. It illustrates the concept, however, quite nicely. But I do have a disclaimer here, just so no one gets too upset. Okay, so in other words, pairings, not just for plate waste consideration, but for healthy, nutritious considerations. So again, if I'm the food service worker, I want to see data that's going to help me plan menus that are going to decrease waste, but also improve nutrition. Waste, as we said at the beginning, gets at the notion of improved nutrition. When there's less waste, more nutrients are consumed. But the actual pairings, every food item has its own indigenous or endogenous, excuse me, nutrient content. And so that's a factor to keep in consideration as well. Okay, so I think I'm right on the schedule here. I have a couple of slides to share with you regarding what they're doing in Japan in their school meals, because I didn't know this until fairly recently. They have a childhood obesity problem now in Japan, okay? And so they've taken some steps to address it. Japanese schools offer no freedom of choice to their students, okay? They want vending machine items? Sorry, can't do that. And so everyone is getting a dietitian, nutritionist planned meal that is dominated by rice, vegetables, soups, and fish. cost effective. And they've also they have data to show that the incidence of childhood obesity has been decreasing for both boys and girls, especially the youngest ages, the elementary school kids. That's what you see here with this tail and that one. Okay. So that's a success story in school meals. And then closer to home, what impresses you from this slide? There's one age group here where the childhood obesity rates have been on the decline. I wish I could say it was the school age group. It's preschool, ages 2 to 5. What's this one? That's gone up a little bit. They're all too high. Okay, I'm not arguing that, but yeah, the high school age. We don't have time, but the high school situation is pretty wide open. Open campuses, low participation in the USDA school lunch, and so forth. Kids bring their own money, go out, walk to a convenience store, buy stuff there. Challenges. So I go through these pretty quickly. Decreased energy and nutrient intake was a result of plate waste and the vegetable types in each of the newly designated subcategories that I shared with you. There was no statistically significant difference in plate waste except among legumes comparing the pre and post new standards. Nutrient intake was based on plate waste. High percentiles of plate waste are not always indicators of poor nutrient intake. Example, vitamin A and fiber. The least amount of observed plate waste was with the menued potato products. We observed a relationship between entree and vegetable pairing. Further study is required to determine if this relationship is reproducible and statistically valid. Sodium consumption was exceeded the recommended amounts for some of the entree vegetable pairings, something that also has to be kept in mind and watched. Potato products, especially whole baked potato, often provided more potassium than any of the other vegetables. Goes back to that issue of excluding white potatoes. Now, when potato products were served, children consumed adequate amounts of calories and 2 of the 4 shortfall nutrients, the fiber and the potassium. We also, I should say, had data for calcium, but you don't typically think of calcium good sources being vegetables. And indeed, the amounts that we were looking at were low, although slightly higher than very low is still promising, although then we have the issue of is that calcium bioavailable. Limiting starchy vegetables, including potatoes, may be contraindicated based on positive effects, including less plate waste, more consumption, and more associated nutrient intakes. Therefore, the National School Lunch Program is indeed a field-ready or ready field laboratory from which to observe important food consumption and waste behaviors. Plate waste can provide information regarding specific nutrients lost versus consumed, related to 2 major impact areas of interest to the USDA, child food insecurity and obesity. And it may be prudent to study these pairings of entrees and vegetables that may reduce plate waste and enhance consumption, and communicate these to school food service and other stakeholders. Oh my gosh, I've got more. Although presented more as an educational exercise here, it appears that certain entree vegetable pairings may make achieving nutrition goals and nutrient standards more easily than others, especially with respect to reduced sodium and total fat levels and higher potassium and fiber. Plate waste observations indicate there's a need to decrease plate waste via carefully considered targeted interventions, such as taste tests in schools. Taste tests with children in schools to observe their behaviors. Last, are you aware that the next child nutrition reauthorization is coming up next year? Okay. I worked on one back in 2005. Going through that process was amazing. In a way, we can all work on this one if we're interested by providing our feedback, our input to USDA. They actually look at it. I know the person or group of people who receive comments and review them. They look at all of them. It's amazing. So this is a venue, a way to improve what's currently in practice, because comments are considered. Look at the expiration date for what we've got. That's it. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Yes.
Do you foresee them, I guess, in the next round, changing the national school lunch program or updating recommendations? Do you see them changing the identification of French fries vegetable? Do you see that changing?
What do you see? What do you hope not to see?
I guess I'm.
Because you're passionate about this, I'm curious about
Well, I guess, you know, with your presentation of potassium and fiber, it kind of changed my mind a little bit. At first,
Okay.
when you see French fries vegetable,
Yeah.
you're like, what?
it. I agree. I mean, with everything, it's a complex issue because the French fry is not just about potassium and fiber. So we have to consider the other issues, especially saturated fat and total fat. So I'd love white potatoes to stay in, but not fried potatoes. That's my own personal. It's a good question.
I noticed with the Japan, now they're not allowing high school to take packed lunches. Did you notice, or I know this wasn't like what you were looking at, but based on spring 2012 and then fall 2012, is there a greater extent of parents packing their kids' lunch because they don't want them?
It's a wonderful question. I don't have that data to share. I can't give an answer. And my hope is that because this program has been so improved over the years, that more children will take advantage of it, and parents will get their kids enrolled in the school lunch. Everybody wins if they do. But yeah, sometimes there's a perception that the school lunch is just for the poor kids. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Did you look at any other like profiles of the kids, like medication they hadn't been on or something like that?
That would require quite an IRB document to be completed. This is the institutional review board that reviews all protocols that have human subject participation. We were essentially, we had a very light route with the IRB because we didn't have an intervention with the kids. We didn't even ask them to complete questionnaires. So we have an easy in to the schools when we present them with that kind of research proposal. So the answer is no, as much as the researcher wants to get additional information like that. That would be a much more difficult study to get approved, but important.
Peter, why don't we just give the kids a smaller serving size? If they're hungrier, they'll eat more of it, there'll be less waste. They won't throw away 50% of the food because their stomachs growl. Is that a foolhardy rationale?
It makes a lot of sense. The challenge is in convincing the food service folks, the dietitian, that this is really the way to go. So it could be tried. I think it should be pilot tested, actually, because who knows, it might come out that, quite frankly, if you remember, the slide showed that K through 5 get the same amount of food. So the kid who's this big and the kid who's this big are getting the same meal. So it sort of is counterintuitive to be feeding the little ones all that food. And yet they're growing, they need it, it's based on science evidence. But this is a nice idea. I would love to pilot test a reduced item serving size meal, especially the elementary. Very good question.
Did you see any differences with that time, that lunch period? Because you know, some lunches are really early.
We didn't,
right after
absolutely,
break.
Ken, thank you. Yeah, One of the factors that needs to be controlled in these kinds of studies is the timing of the school lunch. Is it before or after PE? Or recess? And also the time interval. In general, they had 30 minutes in both Dallas and Bryan ISD in these schools. But that's not always a guarantee. So that has to be controlled if possible. And I'll tell you, there's very little that you can do to control anything, and you don't want to come across as asking for control. They'll tell you, this is what we do. You can come in on this